welcome folks to another edition of Chatting with Ingram. Now, today I'm chatting with Lisa Forte because we're just coming up into a series of rail strikes that are probably stopping both of us getting to InfoSec in London, which is a right pain in the backside. But whenever you look at what's going on around the rail strikes and what's happening across the country, and you look at a lot of the information that's coming out in the news and on social media and all the rest of it, we have to ask the question as to whether there could be disinformation involved. Hi, Elisa. How are you?
Hi, it's great to be here.
Yeah, and disinformation. Now you're just back from a former state that was in the Soviet Union. So you've clearly been away there doing nothing but researching disinformation. Isn't that right?
It depends who's asking, I suppose, would be the answer. But back from Kazakhstan, which has a reputation that actually was rather unwarranted. I was quite surprised actually when I was there. Everything was open. You could read BBC News, New York Times. I was sort of expecting some level of restriction, but they were more interested, in fact, of actually restricting Russian propaganda than they were restricting news information from the West, which surprised me somewhat. But regardless, you can imagine that they are a country that Russia has focused its sights on in some level, especially with regards to keeping people friendly and pro-Russian, I suppose. So,
yeah, no, it's interesting, and it's interesting to see the sea change that there is across a lot of the former Soviet states that are out there. Russia disinformation. How much is it true that Russia is behind lots of disinformation, and how much of it's just hype?
I actually think that we hugely underestimate Russia. From a disinformation perspective and from a subversive action perspective as well. I think there's been, during this conflict in Ukraine, I think largely we focused on their, relatively inadequate military strategy. And we focus very heavily on that. But I think one thing that the Russians are really good at is something they call active measures, and something that has been employed in Russia for, it was actually a term used in the Soviet Union, wasn't it? Active measures, to describe sort of political influence and subversive operations. So I think it's something that they have become very, very good at, very, very effective at. And I think we are still dangerously underestimating how much influence they can have over things and how much disruption they can cause in a kind of under the radar sort of manner.
Well, yeah, it's part of the Russian psyche, and the Russians have got this fantastic word called maskirovka, which is all about masking, and it's all about sort of leaving half truths out there to try and influence things in different ways. And we've seen it over the years. We used to be good at it years ago. Second World War, when it came to the promulgation of disinformation and propaganda, we managed to convince Hitler that we were going to attack into Europe through the Pas-de-Calais and rather than through Normandy. But the Russians have had this, it's part of everything that they do, and their influence is superb. And if you remember, there was talk about Russian potential influence into the US presidential elections,
yep.
the Brexit referendum, a number of EU elections, and then we had the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think if you look back through Russia's history, the only time that perhaps you could argue that this sort of tailed off a little bit was during sort of Gorbachev's reform era in the 1990s, something like that. But then since Vladimir Putin has become sort of the leader and taken control of Russia, you've seen like a huge restoring of intelligence services to their sort of KGB era level of funding and activity. We also saw the exposure of Russia's Internet Research Agency, which I believe was around 2016 that was exposed at their sort of troll farm type affairs, which also shows just how organized it is, how strategic it is, how planned it is. And that should make us more worried than we are. And I think people focus very heavily on Twitter and sort of saying, oh, there are these accounts on Twitter. And I think the dangerous situation is actually more Telegram and sort of less obvious forms of influence than Twitter, where you have a platform to report, you have a platform to debunk things. And I think we're dangerously underestimating them, to be honest.
Yeah, see, this is where when I look at the analysis on it, I bring in a new term called self-misinforming groupthink. Because you think about it in Twitter, and you see all these Twitter fights. Twitter just seems to be a free for all for fights a lot of the time, when people with different opinions want to disagree with each other, and it's fun to watch and it's fun to participate in from time to time. I may be guilty, or I may not. But a lot of people out there on Twitter, they'll put something out as their opinion, and usually it's politically motivated or something else. And all these people come back, and anyone that that disagrees with them or starts an argument, people block them.
Yeah.
And that then means that the timeline of the stuff that's coming through with the person that's put their commentary out, after a period of time, everything that comes in seems to agree with them, and people then go, oh, okay, then my views must be right because I've got 650 followers, and therefore all of my 650 followers agree with me completely, therefore I am right. But actually, if you've got someone who's blocking anyone that is opposing what you're saying, you are putting out alternative arguments, you're not letting them into your timeline, and therefore you're not getting that balanced picture. And this is where Telegram is really dangerous, because people opt into the Telegram channels, and people tend to only opt into the Telegram channels that are giving you the information that you're nodding with and you're agreeing with, and you're going, oh yes, oh God, that makes sense, and everything else. And it's informing that self-misinforming groupthink that you've got, and you're not getting a balanced picture. And that's why, as you said, it is a classic channel for disinformation.
Yeah, and I think, it's architecture. Telegram's architecture really lends itself to this, because it actually really makes public pushback very, very difficult. There's no central public feed like there is in Twitter. There's no, you can easily disable comments in the channels, so you can't necessarily rebut things that you think are incorrect. And I think that's why you've seen, for example, in 2020, the protests in Belarus against President Lukashenko, that was all organized on Telegram, for that very reason, that it was really effective at rallying support. And we've seen, I think someone reported something like 52% or something increase in Russian account creation on Telegram alone since the invasion happened. So it's a really effective platform for spreading a lot of disinformation and spreading it under the radar. Obviously, also added to the fact that it was actually created and founded by a Russian who, at best, has some slightly shady dealings and goings on with how he runs the company.
Yes, Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram and a billionaire. He's been nicknamed the Mark Zuckerberg of Russia, and worth, I think, it was a while ago that they did this, but over 15 billion. Now, if you're in Russia and you're worth that sort of money, the only way that you stay out of jail is if you're in bed with those in political leadership and all the rest of it, in the same way the oligarchs are. So we've got a channel created by a Russian with clear links into the state, because if he hadn't got links into the state, he still wouldn't be in business. And it's passing out lots of disinformation. Oh my goodness, shock horror.
I know. Yes, exactly. It's a bit when you start to unpick it, it looks all a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? But it's quite interesting. And when you look at the channels that are clearly at best pro-Russian, at worst run by Russian accounts, and you're looking at the types of arguments that they're putting forward. I mean, there was one video that you've probably seen where that was actually retweeted lots of times on Twitter, also by Russian accounts, by Russian official state accounts, which was a French individual who was being interviewed by a French journalist, allegedly in France. And what had happened was this French bloke was claiming that he'd gone to Ukraine to fight and be sort of humanitarian worker on the side of Ukraine. And then he was talking to this journalist, and he was saying, what I saw there really changed my viewpoint, because what I saw was Ukrainian soldiers wearing swastikas and talking about horrendous things to do with sort of effectively white supremacist Nazi-esque mentality, taking drugs, raping women, doing these horrible things. And I thought, I can't support Ukraine anymore. Russia's right. And it was a really, really effective video, because even though I knew this was clearly not true, and I definitely don't support anything that Russia is doing in Ukraine, even watching it, I thought, you know what, this is really persuasive, because you've got someone who's French, who went to fight for Ukraine, who's talking to a French journalist in France,
Yep.
It's not a, it looked really, really convincing. And this is how good they are at actually putting things out that at least make that sort of dividing line between good and wrong
Yep.
blurred.
Yeah, no, and I've seen that before. I've seen that in certain election videos and referendum videos and various other things that have done the circulation. And it's only whenever you start to dig in round who's financing it and why has that message been put together and where has it been written, and you're getting into the subtleties of the messaging. And this is where the fascinating bit comes in, because and this is where Cambridge Analytica was so dangerous in the past. I've done a blog on my site which I've entitled "Hacking Your Serotonin," and it was about the last election. But there were two bits of research. One was looking at an aggressive type of marketing and how you can get your marketing messages done in a certain way to influence people. But the other was looking at big data and applying artificial intelligence to big data. And when that big data has come from individual social media profiles, you can actually build up a picture where you know an individual and what's influencing them better than they know it themselves, because you can see what's influencing their friends. You can see what they like. You can see what they don't like. You can see what they block. You see what they don't block. You can see what other feeds that are coming in. And Facebook is analyzing that minute by minute, second by second, because that's why you get targeted adverts at you. Because their big data and their AI is looking at everything that you do and then saying these goods are good for you. Have a look at them. If countries can get hold of that and then start to influence those around you and passing things into your feed that reinforce your views, or they come to the top of your feed rather than halfway down your feed or at the bottom of your feed, then it starts to slowly but surely change the way people think. And all of that's to do is changing the brain chemistry. And it's done very subtly, very slowly, and everything else, but it's very, very effective. And people won't realize and don't realize it happens. And, for those that are listening who don't know, I'm ex-military. And in the military, we've got information operations, and part of information operations are influence operations and propaganda. And that's what it's all about. And it works. It works really well indeed. And part of the propaganda is dropping something that goes big and bang and explodes close to somewhere. And then you send a message the next day saying, if you don't leave this place, there's going to be an even bigger one comes tomorrow. It's amazing in how many operations that people leave the place alone and run away whenever those messages land. So it's something that's very, very real.
And I think your point about social media is really prudent, because actually a lot of the problem that we have with disinformation on social media is like the concept of virality, of the concept that this thing could spread almost at an exponential rate around the world. And one of the things that I've been reading about recently is a theory, a bit like how on the stock market, if you see a particular stock plummeting and it drops by, say, 20%, the stock market, the London Stock Exchange, or whoever can pause the trading on that particular stock to basically give a cooling off period. And I think it was on one of NATO's blogs, they were talking about the need for this on social media, because the problem is you have something that's hugely emotive, hugely sort of controversial, or as you said, that serotonin sort of effect that it has on the reader, who then amplifies it, retweets it, comments, etc. And the virality of this post can then spread hugely. And people aren't reading the things, they're not necessarily analyzing it, they're just hitting retweet or hitting share, and it spreads hugely and you can't control it. And that's the big problem that social media has, unfortunately. It's all kind of geared towards that sharing culture, which is fine if it's approved and well, not approved, but factually based. But obviously things that are factually based often aren't hugely emotive. So
and the other thing is we get influencers across the board, whether they be business influencers like Elon Musk, whenever he turned around and said that Dogecoin was going to be his next big thing. Dogecoin went through the roof in crypto. Whenever he said that Tesla was going to accept Bitcoin to buy its cars, Bitcoin rose. And then whenever he turned around and said, oh, we're not going to anymore, Bitcoin dropped. So you got the influencers. We then look at how political leaders and political influencers put their messaging out, and there's always a spin on it, and it's that spin that is part of disinformation, because it's not giving the complete truth, and you're deliberately putting out something that is not completely true in order to try and mislead people to believing that your way is the right way. Well, if we've got our political leaders doing it, it's going to be so easy for nation states who have this as a doctrine to exploit it.
Totally. And I think, as you just said, our leaders generally do it. So I think it's also really important to recognize that it can go both ways. We can very much have Russian misinformation that furthers their agenda that we have to be very careful of, but we also have to be very careful of things that very neatly fit within our biases, because the chances are that could be propaganda as well, which obviously equally is distorting our view of the world and our view of risks and threats around the world. So I think it's really important that you actually are critically assessing everything, whether it's super convenient for you or not. I think you have to be really careful.
Yeah. Do you think human beings are actually generally equipped to be able to deal with the volume of information that's coming into them at the moment, and do that analysis to make sure that they understand that what they're reposting or commenting on or all the rest of it isn't something that is deliberately designed to mislead?
I think there's sort of an exhaustion of critical thinking that's happened. And I sort of feel that the amount of information that we're being bombarded with, some of which is wholly false, partially false, true, whatever the composition of it is, ends up being so exhausting to our critical thinking skills that actually it leads us to sort of an inability to make informed decisions about things we're reading. I also think our media cycle is really dangerous as well, from the perspective of how fast we have to put out content. There is no way you can responsibly verify a fact if you have to put it out at the rate that you are doing. And that's the other problem with social media. I've spoken to journalists who say, it's almost impossible to go and verify all these different sources in different ways, because by the time I've done that, someone's posted about it on Twitter, whether it's true or not, and that story is gone. So it makes it very difficult to make sure we're having that responsible journalism element.
Yeah. Well, and you combine that with the fact that you can get a message to a global leader. Donald Trump highlighted this more than anyone, but I know that I could send a tweet to Donald Trump and he would possibly have read it. And we know that he was reading people's tweets and reacting to them. A supposed leader of the free world, reacting to things that are coming through on Twitter, reacting to something that's in 240 characters. You can't have a sensible argument or put a sensible discussion point out in 240 characters, no matter how good you are.
Yeah, and I think, the general trust in mainstream media has also declined over the years as well. And I think that doesn't help. I can't remember what the new statistic is, but some insane number of people get their news solely from Facebook or from social media. So we've sort of boxed ourselves into a bit of a corner here, unfortunately, and it's become a bit of a race to who's better equipped to exploit that than it has anything else.
Yeah. So, do you think the Russians are exploiting this, especially in the UK at the moment?
Definitely. And I think, if you think about it from their perspective, why wouldn't you? They've always talked about the need to have this hybrid war situation. And I think they knew from a long time ago that their military wouldn't stack up to the force of NATO or the United States by itself even. And so they had to employ different methods to disrupt and get control of situations. And that's where their active measures sort of doctrine, I suppose, came from. So I would say, anything that's hugely disruptive to the UK economy, to the UK population and society and how we function, you can see the motivation for being involved in that in some way, or at least amplifying it, would definitely be there. And if I was Vladimir Putin, that would definitely be a wise play, I think.
Well, and he's got the intelligence resources around to do it. There's a specialist GRU unit, and the GRU are the Russia's military intelligence, their first directorate, the oldest of their intelligence organizations, but they carry out a lot of the direct action. So it was the GRU that put intelligence officers on the ground to try and poison Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia, that tried to hack into the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in Den Haag in the Netherlands, whenever Russia was being investigated for the Sergei Skripal attack. And one of their units is a disinformation unit. And I was only commenting on in the Sunday papers this weekend that the Russian intelligence activities have been ramping up. Ever since the Cold War finished, after the Cold War, there were more Russian intelligence officers operating inside the capital cities of Europe and the United States than there were at the height of the Cold War. Now that got affected after Sergei Skripal, whenever a lot of the undeclared intelligence officers were thrown out of the country. To throw them out of the country, we clearly knew about them and we knew who they were, but they just hadn't been formally declared by the Russian embassy as being intelligence officers. Now that did impact the Russians, but since then they've been rebuilding the capability back up again, and they know what makes the country tick. They know what the concerns are, and that they will look at every opportunity that they can to put this disinformation wedge into the crack of concerns between 2 or 3 different parties and wiggle it as much as possible to fraction it and fracture it open even more. And I think that's what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. And it was quite interesting because when I was in Kazakhstan, I spoke to a couple of Russians who were there some of them were there on holiday and some of them were there because they had left Russia for obvious reasons. And they were saying that even in Russia, they're well aware of this. This is not something that they are by any means blinkered to. But as they were saying, the vast majority of the young population in Russia is relatively free thinking. They, at least have an inquiring mind and maybe question some of the narrative that's coming out. But the vast majority of Russians who live outside of the major cities, who maybe don't have access to that kind of education and training and so on and so forth, all they have to know about what's going on in the world is the TV and the newspapers and the radio that's put out and controlled by the Russian state. So you can't really blame them for truly believing what's being fed to them, because that's all they're being fed. And that's the other side to the Russian state, so to speak. They've always been very, very good at controlling the message going out to the world, but also controlling the message inward to their own population and the narrative that they're going to feed them, which has always been very carefully curated and has usually been about Russia being this saving grace that's going out and usually annihilating some sort of highly right-wing Nazi kind of force within a country, owing mainly because of the sort of the relationship that Russia had or the Soviet Union had during World War II and the fight against the actual Nazis. So it's an easy sell to their population. So I think it's really important to see how the whole situation works with Russia, because it's very much not just outward looking disinformation.
Well, exactly. And at the end of the Second World War, we then transitioned straight into the Cold War effectively with Russia. Yet we'd been allies fighting the Germans and then the growth of the Nazis across Europe with their attempt to grow across the globe. So it's fascinating to see how that changed. And from a Russian psyche, and this is why they mistrust NATO, the Russian psyche is that they still believe that there's a conflict going on, and there always has been with the West, and that the West is this big enemy trying to attack them, which is a lot of what drives Vladimir Putin's decision making and what's going on. So, it's scary times, actually.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately the sanctions actually reinforce that. Although obviously sanctions have to happen, their effectiveness is probably something that's beyond the scope of this podcast to discuss, but the sanctions do in fact give him another arrow, I suppose, for his internal disinformation, because it very much does look like an attack by the West to deprive Russian people of food, of services, of companies, of whatever, and so that then adds further credibility, I suppose, to the message that they are under attack and this is this evil Western organization.
It is, and looking at the attacks and bits and pieces. One of the things everyone was scared about whenever the Russians reinvaded Ukraine in February was the potential for Russian cyber and further active measures against the West and all the rest of it. But we haven't quite seen that. Any thoughts on that?
So I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think there's two sides to this, really. I think firstly, the thing with cyber weapons is that actually they are not a replacement for kinetic warfare, and I don't think they ever will be a replacement for kinetic warfare, because they don't have the same utility. They also don't have a great a sort of shock and awe image to go with it, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to scare the West, you can't have a photo of a kid with a bleeding head because of a cyber attack. You know, you want to see blown up buildings and things like that. That's what scares people. So I think that's the first side of it. I think the other thing that's really interesting about cyber weapons is actually they're very, very difficult to control. And
Yep.
we have seen time and time again that actually they spread and that you lose control of them very quickly. And I think Russia's strategy to date has been to really have a below the threshold war that doesn't drag NATO in. And I think the concern is if you lost control of a cyber weapon, you could very well pull NATO into something that you didn't want to pull them into. So I think their strategy has been to avoid that from that perspective and just attack Ukrainian organizations to a not very sophisticated extent, to be fair. But then, you know, you don't know. Maybe they don't have the cyber weapons that we believed that they did have, in the same way that we believed they had a much more capable military than they seem to have.
But then we've seen some of the cyber weapons being beta tested beforehand. You know, the 2017 attacks and bits and pieces have shown that they have the ability. But the one thing it did highlight, which is what you said, is they haven't got control over it, and I don't think anyone does. And whenever I keynote speak on this, the other thing I say is, look, you know, a cyber weapon isn't going to stop a 152 millimeter high explosive shell or 7.62 millimeter short AK-47 round, or a 40-year-old aircraft that is dropping dumb bombs onto places, because there's nothing electronic in it or cyber in it. And when it comes to battlefield cyber, you've got electronic warfare. So you've got jamming, which is deliberate denial of service, which forces people onto another communications means. That you've got intercept, which is, you know, the theft of data. So, you know, different terminology, but it's effectively the same sort of thing that's happening.
Yeah, and I think if you look at how they attacked Ukraine prior to the invasion, obviously they tried to sabotage the election systems, didn't they? That wasn't hugely successful. Then they attacked. There was a sort of power plant, I think, that they attacked that they managed to bring down for the whole of 6 hours or something. It was really very ineffective. Yeah. Then there was the sort of sandworm next attack that was supposed to build on it, but they hadn't actually anticipated that the Ukrainians had built in a backup that was manual, and so that led to basically nothing. And then you had NotPetya, which was successful, but it also highlights how much collateral damage and what the lack of control was that they had over that, because it spread everywhere.
Yeah, and I think it affected more machines inside the Russian Ministry of Defense buildings and other Russian government departments than it did machines across the globe. So a bit of an own goal when it comes to that. But the one thing that doesn't seem to come into the cyber environment, and again, we've talked about this before, and I throw it out to cyber environments to say, look, you know, should disinformation and the power of information be something that, as cybersecurity professionals, it should be on your radar, and should cybersecurity professionals be responsible for it? You know, what are your thoughts on that?
I think we should definitely take more of a role in it, and I think, you know, we have abilities within our community to establish the integrity of information and the integrity of images, the integrity of videos, the authenticity of those things that a lot of other industries don't have. So I think it fits more comfortably in our area of expertise than it does a lot of other areas, to be honest. But it's really difficult, and it's really messy, because the chances are there's not a country in the world that isn't engaged in this on some level. Obviously the Russians are particularly good at it, but I think we've seen, you know, the Brazilians are having an election in October. The Brazilian Supreme Court banned Telegram because they were so concerned that this was actually going to swing the election in some capacity and make it, you know, less free and fair election for them. They've now reinstated Telegram after Telegram made promises that we'll see if they keep. But the point is that this is something that every single country that operates with a democracy needs to be concerned about, and it affects everyone. It affects us from a company perspective and an economic perspective as well. It's not just about human rights and democracy preservation, it's about everything we hold dear in our life, really.
Yeah. So bring it back to the fact that neither of us seem to be able to get to infosec, which is terrible, and that's all down to these rail strikes. Do you think that there's a potential that the Russians might have been influencing the RMT who are behind the rail strikes?
I think it would make strategic sense. It's a hugely disruptive event. I don't know how many millions of people will be impacted by this. Obviously, it's also Glastonbury weekend, which is the UK's biggest festival, biggest event, really, I suppose, of the year. All of which causes huge amount of disruption. But as I'm sure you can now attest to further, there have been some interesting links brought to people's attention, have there not?
Well, there've been some very interesting links when you go to the past, and sticking my old intelligence officer's hat on. I've only had a very short period of time to do some research, but some of the big names from the RMT have got very close connections to Russian linked organizations and have come out in complete support of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine in some of the commentary, which is not very pleasant to think about. I've seen pictures of the RMT Assistant General Secretary Steve Headley with an AK-47 and a Russian hat on, supposedly in a marketplace in eastern Ukraine. There have been pictures of Eddie Dempsey, and there's been a couple of stories in the Telegraph and the Evening Standard and all the rest of a visit to Eddie Dempsey, who's another Assistant General Secretary, visiting a warlord, Alexander Mozgoyov, who was an ultra uber nationalist, misogynistic paramilitary leader in the pro-Russian militias in the Donbass region. Interestingly, Mozgoyov died not long after Dempsey's visit. Now, that was back in 2015, but Dempsey hasn't done anything to condemn what's going on. And then I've seen pictures of Alex Gordon, who is a real union activist and member of the Communist Party Popular Sovereignty, standing in Russia with that purple and orange band that you see the Russians who are supporting the activities into Ukraine, the Russian war into Ukraine, that people seem to be wearing, and he's wearing that on his coat. And from all of these different symbols and connections and links and all the rest of it, you have to ask, have they put themselves in a position that they could easily be compromised by the Russian state from a disinformation perspective, and therefore influenced to do things that would disrupt things in the UK and therefore meet Russian state objectives? And the overwhelming answer for that is, of course they will. They're 100%, from my old intelligence perspective, they will have been on the influence list. And whether that has directly led to what's happening this week, it's impossible to say, but the chances of the Russians of having had a major influence on it are very, very high indeed. And I'm afraid, to all our union members out there, supporting this action is effectively supporting what Putin's doing, because Putin will want this to transition into a summer and winter of discontent, of more actions by more unions. And if that happens, Putin will be sitting there saying, I've got success. Now, whether he's had to do that by doing a little bit of influence, a medium amount of influence, or a large amount of influence doesn't really matter. If he's had his finger in the pie, and he almost certainly has, he'll be sitting behind his big oak desk in the Kremlin in Moscow with a very large glass of vodka over ice in Russian crystal, with his white cat on his knee, stroking it, going, yes, this is fantastic. People are doing my job for me.
Yeah, and I think, as you said earlier, the Russian oligarch system, really wealthy people in Russia aren't there and aren't wealthy because they have sort of done it in some sort of innovative, building an organization type of way. It's been very much with Putin's seal of approval. And we know how that, generally speaking, the oligarchs are very, very much under Putin's thumb. That's how he's probably one of the richest men in the entire world. But we've seen the way that this can actually work in a very subtle way. I mean, we know that the interference that the Russians played with Trump way before he even announced he was running for president or was intending to run for president. There was a lot of Russian money flowing into the Trump organization. There was lots of things being done that were suspicious now in hindsight, but at the time clearly flew under the radar. No one thought to question it. Very similarly to how you were saying now with this. People aren't questioning it now, but when you look back on it in years to come, it suddenly starts to look a bit strange that this money was flowing. And the fact is, as you said, none of this happens in an autocracy without the head of that autocracy at least knowing about it, if not actually ordering it and authorizing it.
Yeah, and, and on that point, I think we could talk about this all afternoon because it's a fascinating subject. But I think for those that are listening, just be aware the Russians are influencing us. The Chinese are influencing us. They have tried to influence the Conservative government as much as they've tried to influence the Labour opposition, as much as they're trying to influence the unions and everything else against what we're doing. So no one is clear of all of it. So this isn't a party political piece in any way, shape, or form. It's just realizing that that influence is out there. And unfortunately, I think that influence is what's causing this massive effect that is going to disrupt so many lives over this week and potentially the coming months.
Yeah, definitely.
Lisa, it's been a real pleasure talking to you as ever on Chatting with Ingrid. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to share if you like what you've heard, and I look forward to being with you next time.